Welcome back to night 2 of the Republican National Convention here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Senate Republican Conference Chair John Barrasso of Wyoming joins us now. Senator, good to see you.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
I want to talk to you about JD Vance. You serve with him in the Senate. He's a new senator. What do you make of him? What kind of vice president would he make?
Well, he'll be a terrific vice president. I mean, he is forceful. He's effective. Of course, he's conservative. If you know his history from reading, as I have Hillbilly Elegy, before he got to the Senate, I said, this guy's going to be good from day one, and he has been, because nobody, I think, can articulate the pain that the American families have been through over the last 4 years better than he can, from his upbringing and then his time as a Marine and now as a young father of young children. It's interesting in terms of being from Ohio. I think from the standpoint of the election and helping President Trump, he can really speak so well to so many of these disenfranchised Democrats that feel left behind from the party, their own party, that has gone so far to the left. And in terms of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, I think those states are ones that JD will really be very, very effective. Now, I'm going to hate to miss him and lose him from the Senate, but what you saw tonight here in the stage, all of these Senate candidates are just doing a fabulous job. 8, 9, 10 Senate seats that we're trying to competitively bring to the Republican side, because if we're going to get America back on track, we're going to need more Republican senators. We're going to need a majority.
How does that look right now, that race for the Senate and Republicans retaking the Senate?
Well, I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic. I've been in many of those states, and I'm going to continue to travel to each one of those states. I'd rather be us than them. We need a majority because President Trump is going to need a strong Senate majority to get an agenda passed. So if you take a look at any of these candidates, they're forceful, they're really effective individuals running strong campaigns, and I'm supporting each and every one of them.
Senator, I know you're a man of substance as an orthopedic surgeon and a Georgetown graduate, and you're on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So let me ask you about Ukraine, because Senator JD Vance opposes funding for Ukraine. And in fact, in a podcast 2 years ago, he told Steve Bannon, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another. If elected with President Trump, also has not indicated that he would continue funding for Ukraine, what would that mean?
Well, first, let's look what President Trump did when he was president. He made sure that NATO, other countries, did their job. He raised an additional $100 billion from NATO countries for defense, and they need to do their job. I've talked to JD, been in the conference meetings when he talks about Ukraine. What he wants to know and make sure is that the United States can lead through strength, the old Ronald Reagan approach. You never get into trouble as a nation if you are too strong, and he wants us to be strong, and his focus is China, which truly is the long-term threat to our nation.
But if President Trump and Vice President JD Vance said to the United States Senate, no more funding for Ukraine, would you go along with that?
I don't believe they'll say that. I think they want to make sure we have a strong defense, a strong military, that we come from a position of strength, and that puts our enemies in a position of weakness. And I think that's what they're going to try to do. But the long-term focus has to be China. President Trump was the first person to identify China as a real threat. Remember when Joe Biden announced for president, he said, China's our friend, man. He completely misunderstood the threat that we have from China that continues today. And as JD has said, anything that's not focused on China can become a distraction. We can't become distracted from the #1 enemy that we have in terms of the people that want to be the military, the economic, the technological superpowers of the world. And that's where China is heading now in terms of AI, in terms of military, in terms of the build-ups.
But I don't think there's anything in the Biden-Harris administration in terms of the intelligence and national security that's not taking China seriously as a threat.
Well, we just had a hearing in the Energy Committee. I'm the ranking member. That China is using all of its energy for AI. I mean, we've been at Microsoft headquarters talking to those people. We've looked at this very carefully. AI is going to be determined by the amount of energy you have to run the computers. China is never going to be able to outwit the United States in terms of our intellectual ability with AI and working on that. but they may be able to beat us by having enough power to work their supercomputers. That's where we're falling behind. We don't have enough power for the grid now. The demands for energy in this country over the next 5 years, even the New York Times reported this, it would be like adding a whole new California to the grid. And this administration is shutting down coal-fired power plants. Natural gas-fired power plants are not allowing us to build the sort of energy, which is a long-term weapon. And China is going to beat us in energy, which then means computing power.
I do want to ask you about Saturday's assassination attempt, and I understand that senators are being briefed tomorrow on this. Do you believe that the Secret Service director is responsible and should resign?
This is a complete failure by the Secret Service. Anyone who's looked at this, the video and the signs and the maps of what's happened first, President Trump, the Bible, we talk about be strong and courageous, do not be afraid. What we saw is somebody who is a survivor and a warrior as he has stood up afterwards, defiant, and said, fight. But there's a tragedy here. There was a firefighter, a fire chief, 50 years old, died defending his family, protecting his family. And it's just, I think most Americans say, how in the world did a shooter get on a roof 130 yards away? And for hunters in Wyoming, they know that's not very long of a shot. And to have a clear shot at the president or former president of the United States, that shouldn't happen to anybody. Anybody should be, and there has to be accountability. And I think that starts with the head of the Secret Service.
Senator, my colleague Margaret Brennan is back in Washington. I know has a question for you.
Hi, Margaret.
Hey, Senator, good to talk to you. Because you are in Senate leadership, I wanted to ask you, the border is such a key issue for Republicans, but then President Trump was never really able to legislate at all to deal with the border. He relied heavily on executive orders, which meant when Joe Biden was elected, he could just reverse all of them. So I wonder, since we're looking at Trump returning potentially along with the vice president who's just been in the Senate since January 2023, how confident you are that Congress could actually deliver on the promises we're hearing about from the stage to deal with the border? Could you actually get to 60 votes in the Senate and work across the aisle in a Trump administration?
I think 60 votes in the Senate is always going to be a real challenge. What we do know is that when President Trump left office, the border was secure. Very few people were coming across, and we now know since then, under Joe Biden, with, as you point out, 94 executive orders, not a change in the law, but a different interpretation of the law, now cumulatively 10 million illegal immigrants have come into this country. And we know they include criminal cartel members, drug dealers. We know there are terrorist suspects
Trump
among these
did not
groups.
legislate on the border at all. He didn't get bipartisan legislation to deal with any of these problems. What you're talking about at the end of the administration was during the shutdown due to COVID.
What I'm telling you is that there hasn't been a new law written regarding to the border since the 1990s. Simpson-Mazzoli, I talked to 92-year-old Al Simpson about it last week, and what we know is that it's different interpretations of how they want to enforce that law. And President Trump, by remain in Mexico, by not doing catch and release, by working on building a barrier, all those things have helped, and Joe Biden stopped all of those things. He caught and released into the United States. That's the real problem with this. And what we got now is ending the thing that worked best was remain in Mexico. And I hear my friend JD is now taken to the stage.
Yeah. Let's, Margaret, thank you. Vice presidential pick, JD Vance, the senator from Ohio, has, let me see, he's just about to, he's entering from the wings. He's not yet at the podium. Most people standing to get a glimpse of him as he enters here. We're going to hear his speech tomorrow in front of this group. It'll be the third night of the convention, and then we'll hear from former President Trump on the fourth night. And Senator, you just spoke with JD Vance today, didn't you?
Yes, talked to him this evening as he was in his motorcade and I was driving here. I'm supposed to have dinner with him tonight, but it looks like he may be a little late getting out of here.
Who else is going to dinner?
Donald Jr., Donald Trump Jr. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Just the three of you?
There may be a couple of others joining us.
Sounds like an exclusive dinner. Okay. Senator, thank you for joining us. I know you got to get going. We appreciate it. Don't want to make you late for dinner.
Thanks.
Report
you.
back, will you, Senator?